listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us today for this Firestorm RenWeb webinar. We're going to be talking today about behavioral threat analysis, and we have one of the finest speakers in the country that's going to be doing the presentation. We'd like to also invite you to become our Facebook friend at Firestorm Solutions on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag for the session, and that is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm's expertise is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product that we provide today must be read and considered in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel, and the information given and comments made should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're very pleased to have RenWeb as the co-sponsor and host of this Crisis Coach webinar series. How do you know what you don't know? Behavioral threat analysis. Our speaker today will be Susie Laughlin, and we're pleased to have this as part of the webinar today. The Crisis Coach webinar series is underwritten by the RenWeb organization. We're very pleased to have them with us. Our moderator today from RenWeb is Jacqueline Day. Jacqueline, over to you, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for that intro as well. And on behalf of RenWeb, I just want to welcome you to this great webinar. We really appreciate Firestorm hosting this ongoing series of webinars for us. We hope that you find it useful, and we know the content is so important for schools. So we're just pleased that Firestorm has been able to put on this series for us, and we have more to come, so please keep an eye out for an announcement about the next webinar. You should be receiving an email from us, so keep an eye out for that, and thank you so much. I can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Thanks, Jacqueline. This is Jim Satterfield. I'll be our moderator today, and glad to speak again with all of you, and I enjoyed meeting many of you last month in Atlanta at the user group meeting, the RenWeb user group meeting. It was a great opportunity to hear what's going on in your schools and your areas. Susie Laughlin, who is one of the founders of Firestorm, is our EVP and Chief Administrative Officer, and she'll be the primary speaker today. Her area of expertise in the behavioral risk threat assessment area is absolutely critical, and you're going to learn a lot about what the program should be in your school as we come together. We also wanted to give you just a quick update of a lot of the things that we're seeing that are occurring, and certainly are issues to continue to be aware of as we look across the country. The events in Missouri give a great example of how the action of one person then leads to a series of events with the riots and the violence as a result of the shooting that occurred there. It's a situation that gains national prominence and certainly has been a significant disruption to the schools, businesses, families, and individuals there. That's an example of how behavioral threats and violence can certainly have a direct impact on everything that we're seeing. We continue to be aware of communicable illness. The Ebola outbreak in Africa continues to be a significant concern for us across the world, as we're seeing over half of the people who've become infected have died. Controls are still attempting to be developed as they're looking to resolve that. The forecast for the fall for the swine flu by BioRadar is to return at pandemic levels. So this is a good time to review the plan within your school related to communicable illness and how you deal with those things. Clearly, as we look at the Near East with the activities with Israel and Gaza, the exposure in Iraq with the violence that's occurring there, the activities in the Ukraine, we're seeing crises around the world. Really, the difference in many of these cases is having a plan will make a difference in change in outcome, and that's going to be some of the areas that we're going to talk about. We focused heavily in this Crisis Coach webinar series on the concept of preparedness at school. Today, we're going to zero in on the threats that are behind all of our students and that's the Behavioral Risk and Threat Assessment Program that Susie's going to step us through. So, Bill, you should have transferred control to Susie. Susie, you should have control of the slides at this point.
All right, I'm just waiting for Bill to do that, and here we go. Do you guys see my screen at this point?
Yep, and we can, and you're getting us up to the slideshow, and we should be good to go.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be part of this webinar today, and I know you've had an opportunity to participate in many of our other sessions and presentations, and you've probably come to know very well that Firestorm has a methodology that we deploy in virtually everything we do, and we refer to it as PREDICT, PLAN, PERFORM. So when we talk about behavioral risk, the same approach we use, let's talk about PREDICT. So what is it that we're trying to do? With behavioral risk, we're really trying to understand what are the potential behaviors of concern or warning signs that are predictive or perhaps an indication that an individual may ultimately be on a path to violence. Once we understand what those warning signs are, we've done our predictive work, we can develop the plans, we can develop the policies and the procedures and put them in place. And we're going to talk about all of those today. And ultimately, the perform is really, okay, now you've gotten that call. You've gotten someone who's put you on notice of a behavior of concern. What do we do? Who does it? How do they do it? And that's what the Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment Program that Firestorm has developed will walk you through. So, but before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about why we feel this program has so much value. The perpetrators of violence in schools are typically not strangers to us. Acts of school violence are normally perpetrated by employees, by students. They could be former students, and in some cases even domestic partners. You know, we see domestic violence spilling over the workplace. And remember, your schools are also a workplace. Most acts of violence are committed by someone who already has a relationship to your school. So knowing that, when we think about the predictive work that we all need to do to assess threats and vulnerabilities, that includes us, all of us working in schools, identifying the students and employees who need our help. And by the way, this program and the way we, Firestorm, believe it should be approached is not just to address school shootings. As we all know, those are very, very rare situations. But what also happens throughout the year are there are over 2 million reported cases of workplace violence by OSHA, to OSHA and to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And workplace violence can range from threatening behavior, it could be sexual harassment, all the way to that ultimate act of a shooting. The same thing in schools. You know, there are over 2 million reported cases of bullying in schools each year. That's probably no coincidence that it's 2 million that are reported for bullying and 2 million that are reported for workplace violence. Unfortunately, some people grow up, these bullies grow up someday and they're in our workplaces. So we really need to try to identify what are the warning signs. And by the way, the bullying is important because most school shooters are victims of bullying. So let's talk a little bit about warning signs. And that is going to be something that's really important to understand. You know, virtually no accident, no school shooting occurs without someone going back and saying, you know, I knew I should have done this when he said that. Or, you know, I noticed he started to have this fascination with guns on the internet. Or, you know, he told me he was going to kill himself, but then he said it was a joke. You know, of course, we all know those things are never a joke. So almost every disaster, school violence incident, or even acts of terrorism are preceded by warning signs. And we also know that seconds and minutes count. Today our focus is not going to be on the response side. You know, we're not really going to talk about what happens if someone has a weapon at school or wants to commit an act of violence. Obviously, you know, you as schools have your emergency response plans which address lockdown and lockout, and I'm sure you have procedures for what to do if, God forbid, there was a bad actor on your premises. Our goal really is about preventing the gun from ever coming to school. And we mean years before. Our goal is in trying to help schools set up a program that teaches them, you know, what can we do to identify the individuals that do present behaviors of concern, that do need some type of intervention and monitoring and help, frankly. So how is this done? Like all of our plans, within Firestorm, we start with a framework. It's typically based on a policy that will define the goals of the program. So in this case, the Behavioral Risk and Threat Assessment Program has several components. The first is awareness, and by that we mean, what are the warning signs? What are the things that people need to know about the program so that they can be an active participant? And one of those most important things is reporting. So now we see this behavior of concern, and it could be something like a disturbing writing that someone perhaps submitted with an English paper. It could be a comment that was overheard at a lunch table. There are countless examples. But once that event is witnessed or heard by someone, what makes this whole program, everything on this program hinges on that individual reporting it. So we're going to talk a little more about each of these. Once the report is made, there needs to be an investigation. And typically, you'll see here that our program sets it up so that each school would have an administrator on duty who would be part of a threat assessment team, which we'll also talk about a little more. And that person would be charged with doing the preliminary investigation on that report. And it may yield the need to have the individual screened from a risk perspective, some type of a psychological screening. And once that's done, depending on the findings, the case has to be managed. What are we going to do for that individual? What type of intervention will they need? What type of monitoring will we deploy? Will they be perhaps suspended temporarily? Will they be asked to come back and sign some type of a behavior contract? Will we meet weekly to review the student's performance? Those are all the monitoring techniques. So from the awareness perspective, let's start with that. So now we're back to the first one. The awareness is really triggered by an observation. Someone, it could be a student, a faculty member, staff member, a parent, witnesses a behavior of concern. And that behavior of concern in and of itself may not mean that the person is on a path to violence. It's just a data point. And what do we do with these data points? You'll see, like if we look back at whether, it was the Virginia Tech shooting or many others, the shooter in those cases typically exhibits behaviors that people notice, but they don't necessarily happen in a nice order. One behavior might be the paper that was submitted to the English teacher. One behavior might be that, a bus driver saw the student speeding recklessly out of the parking lot. Another behavior may mean that someone might have witnessed someone say something at the lunch table. These are all separate data points, each of which in and of themselves may not mean that we have to trigger a whole threat assessment. But the challenge is, how do we get the full picture? How do we aggregate these reports, these behaviors of concerns in a way that we can do something with this intelligence? So, I was at a conference last year. I was a speaker at the National Business Officers Association, and they had a wonderful gentleman there who did a presentation on the brain pathways and how we learn, and that we should distill what we're trying to present into images. Many of us are visual learners. So I took a shot at it while I was there, and I tried to say, okay, what are we really talking about when it comes to awareness? So here we have, the cheerleader at the school, and she's, a great student. Well, that cheerleader, that behavior is very important because we have a baseline. Change, what many of the experts will tell you is that change is one of the most important variables to pay attention to. If we have the cheerleader who is, doing really well, and I'm just going to advance a couple slides for a second, and then all of a sudden, at some point we see her grades drop, and of course this is my attempt at something obviously pretty exaggerated, but you read about things like with serial killers and others that are, they're not kind to animals. So here I've got my cheerleader, now she's suddenly, strangling a cat and her grades are dropping. Well, that's clearly a warning sign. Something has happened to that person. So there are many. Again, it's important to note that not any individual warning sign is not enough to say that this person's going to commit a bad act, but they are something to take note of. And we have one of our expert council members, Dave Bernstein, used
this visual, which I thought was very helpful in explaining the concept that these behaviors in and of themselves are data points only. And he would use the example of if you took a ball and you threw it up in the air and you took a snapshot of the ball, you wouldn't know if the ball is going up or if the ball is going down. So now we take that over to the human behavior, and we say, okay, when we see this person's behavior, something, one of these warning signs, well, is their behavior escalating? Have they reached the point where perhaps, they're going to be on their way down and it's going to get better, not worse? Or is it something that's just showing us that this person is escalating in a way that they will need some type of intervention? So depending on the behavior, that will trigger the response. So now we've got someone who reported this behavior. It's very important to have multiple ways of reporting. It could be text, it could be email, you could have a hotline, you could have an in-person. But then what's critical is that the reports be logged in some type of a central repository. And we've seen very sophisticated software programs to a simple file folder on a student that, the behavior of a concern gets dropped into a note and it's put in this file folder, and every interval of time that the threat assessment team comes together, they review the behaviors of the week or the month or whatever it is. Some behaviors will trigger, of course, an immediate reaction by the administrator on duty, and they may convene the threat assessment team. But not every behavior. Someone skidding out of the parking lot in and of itself, they might get a reprimand and a warning, but it's not necessarily a sign that they are going to need a threat assessment. At the same time, if all of a sudden we have 4 notes in the file on the same person and they are showing a kind of a pattern, well, maybe now we have more to worry about. The other thing, that's important is that once this report gets filed, so here you got a young man texting in a behavior of concern, that report has to make its way to this defined team of individuals that we call a threat assessment team that have been trained on what to do with this information. And we'll talk about the makeup of that team. The other thing I want to point out is the need for, we believe, anonymous bystander reporting as a capability should exist at every school. There are even some states that have legislated it, like Colorado, where they have something called Safe to Tell. It's SAFE and then the number 2 and then TELL. And Safe to Tell is a program that they've legislated, that all public schools in Colorado have adopted, that students can anonymously report, even by calling the police. They're not allowed to trace the call. They're not, there's no 911 lookup. And this anonymity gives people a comfort level that they can make a report and not get involved. The other type of reporting that we are very concerned about is some type of a suicide reporting capability. Many people who commit acts of violence of the worst kind in schools, and adults, by the way, this isn't just children, the adults as well, are suicidal. So identifying suicide as a risk factor is really critical as part of your overall threat assessment program. So once we have taught everybody on what the warning signs are and given them a way to report them, we now need to be able to evaluate it. We need to be able to assess what are the impacts. And as part of the impact assessment, there's really 2 key pieces. There's the investigation side of it, and there's going to be the screening type of assessment. So first, if the AOD, and that's the acronym for Administrator on Duty, you may have a different term for it, but someone in each school building who's trained as part of the threat assessment team, they receive a report. Their job is really to triage it. Is it the kind of a report that, hey, this is a typical behavior that we handle all the time from a disciplinary perspective and it falls within our normal procedures? Is it something that requires more investigation as part of a preliminary behavioral risk screening? And we recommend that anytime you do that, you're putting your threat assessment team on notice that, hey, I'm not sure I'm going to need you, but we have some report that's been made. Please be on standby because we may need to convene you. And of course, the last category is something that is so worrisome that there's no time for investigation. There's no time for the threat assessment team to convene. We're calling 911 because we perceive there's an immediate need, an immediate danger. So this is an escalation matrix that Firestorm devised that is part of the actual behavioral risk threat assessment plan document. And again, it may vary for you, but this is we attempt to categorize the behaviors in a way that gives you some indication that, hey, we've got something here that this is not business as usual. You know, this is something we're going to escalate to the threat assessment team, and we're going to notify our board as needed. And then, of course, things that go straight to 911. The goal is, of course, when you have this behavior, you want to be able to triage it very quickly because time may be of the essence. So now we do the investigation. You know, sometimes depending on, again, the urgency, it may be important to know where the subject is, the person. And I say subject, it could be an adult, it could be, you know, a student. You know, Firestorm has worked with schools that have had student shootings. We've also worked with schools that have had shootings committed by faculty. So again, I think it's important to look at it as an overall workplace and know that the behaviors of concern that we're focused on are committed by belong to everyone. So as part of your investigation, there are all these different things that you would do. And then if the behavior is such that it falls within that the yellow category that you saw in that matrix, then that means we're really going to bring our threat assessment team together. And that threat assessment team is going to follow a checklist of actions that they need to do, which could include, you know, the need for a subject matter expert. So again, summarizing the program here, you've got this awareness capability. Someone reports it. It goes to the threat assessment team. They refer that individual for some type of screening. It might yield a result that, hey, this person, you know, might need some counseling, some intervention, and the monitoring. So just to spend a couple minutes on the types of threats, there are many threats that could be of concern. And these threats are really threats as defined by, you'll see FBI, Secret Service. This is industry terminology for threat description. And depending on the threat and the circumstances around it, the goal of the threat assessment team is to determine, is this threat a low-level threat, you know, something that we think is really minimal risk of harm to anyone? Is it a medium threat or is it a high threat? And again, this will correlate to who's going to handle it. You know, low risk is something that, you know, again, your administrator on duty or a disciplinarian may deal with. And of course, no matter what type of threat it is and no matter what conclusion you make, there's going to be a need to monitor and to document because you don't know what's coming next. And if it's a medium threat, you know, the medium threat means we're going to do we may be doing a comprehensive behavioral risk assessment and developing a case management plan. And of course, again, monitoring. And finally, high-level threats, again, calling 911, that's the right thing to do. So the next component of the program is case management. When we do case management, we're going to come up with an action plan for the individual. You know, especially with, you know, sometimes in the workplace, an employer may conclude that we're going to terminate an individual because we just don't want the risk. We don't know where this person's headed. We don't want the risk. Now, even in that, the termination itself could cause more risk to the entity if it's not handled properly. So just thinking you can terminate an employee and get rid of your problem is not always the case. And before you would ever terminate someone that you believe exhibited behaviors of concern and could be on a path to violence, you would want to do a full behavioral risk screening of that individual, probably a comprehensive risk assessment, which might mean even bringing in outside resources like a psychologist trained to opine on dangerousness. You know, most school psychologists, if you have them, they have very broad backgrounds, but they're typically not familiar with that type of an analysis. So sometimes we do need to assess whether or not an individual could cause harm before we terminate them as an adult. With students, it's not as simple. I mean, we have all kinds of disciplinary approaches, but and I imagine in the private school sector, expulsion is always one of those avenues. And of course, again, same thing. Just getting rid of someone as a student doesn't mean your problem is gone. So understanding the nature of the threat will be critical. Coordinating with law enforcement, imposing disciplinary actions, re-entry requirements, and a corrective action plan are all part of this case management component. And the monitoring could be, you know, having touch points with your faculty, staff, classmates, you'd monitor behavior through social media, which is a whole separate webinar. I think, Jim, you've probably done, and if not, one that's very important, to understand that individuals use social media oftentimes before they commit a bad act. And in fact, we know statistically that about 80% of school shooters will have told at least one person before they commit the act that they were going to do it, and in 66% of the time, 2 or more people. So social media is a tool that is often used, and therefore the monitoring of it, having that capability is very important. And then, of course, you want to evaluate your effectiveness of your plan. So this is just a visual of the entire process. So how do we do it? How do we implement this framework and this plan? One of the most important things is to identify the roles and responsibilities of the different people within your school environment that will play a role in the program. And that would be everything from starting at your school board, your board of trustees, whatever your terminology is, a threat assessment team, and administrators on duty. And these team members, once they're appointed, would have to have very detailed training. It's usually a good day and a half of training by an expert on these subjects, on what are the warning signs, what are the behaviors of concern, how do we appropriately interview a witness, who are the people we want to talk to, and most importantly, how do we know when it's something we shouldn't handle at all, and bring in the experts who can. That's probably one of the most important components of the training. So your program would outline what the role is of each of the teams. So your school board, for example, they would be charged with saying, okay, we're going to designate administrators on duty. We will establish a threat assessment team. We're going to give them the resources they need and create the policies and give them authorization. We're going to set up this central repository. And all along the way in a very respectful school and work environment. Because one of the things we also know is that you can put all this stuff in place and document up the wazoo, but if your culture doesn't live it, so for example, if someone makes a report and you don't act on it and do nothing, no one's ever going to make a report again because they'll have no confidence, they'll have no trust. So this program, to be effective, really must be deeply embedded in your school culture. The central repository, is establishing some type of, you could call it a warehouse or a vortex, or for these written and verbal submissions. And again, it could be a fancy database, it could be an Excel spreadsheet, it could be a notebook, it could be a file folder. You need to develop the forms that these individuals would fill out, someone who reports the behavior, the form that someone would fill out that's interviewing the witnesses, speaking with the subject. And then you would want to know, what's the response? What are we going to do with these reports? How often are we going to pull our threat assessment team together to review the reports? That's all intertwined in having an effective repository. So the documentation, as I said, is very, very critical. You'd want to have these threat assessment screening sheets and the monitoring plan. You might have a form that you might get information from teachers or parents, and there's a plan of action form. There's all kinds of forms that we have created as part of this program. Awareness, you're going to train. Awareness is all about training, and it's training everyone, especially your students, your faculty, and your staff, and parents. Most parents of students who commit suicide say they never saw it coming. I believe it's something like 80%. So we need to educate everyone. And the ways we train are not so simple. Depending on the student body you have, the cultural makeup, the way we learn, as you in education know, varies. And in some situations, we need peer-to-peer type of training. In some cases, we could learn a lot from focus groups and determine, well, how do we get our messaging across? Do we use signage? How do we get kids to report? How do we get teachers to report? That's really the hardest part. So having these components laid out, and then, of course, knowing what you're going to do when the report comes in. Having an actual checklist, because I can assure you, if something happens that's really scary, your heart rate will be very high, and people don't think optimally when they're in a stressful situation. So having a checklist that can help you identify what are we going to do, who do we call, what is it that we have to say, what forms do we fill out, will be vital. From an investigation standpoint, you have to have a methodology. You have to have people who are trained on knowing how to investigate. From a behavioral screening perspective, depending on the capabilities of your school, a threat assessment team is typically, we usually recommend, it's always a multidisciplinary team, and it could typically includes an administrator, it would include a school psychologist or a counselor. A lot of schools will put on the athletic director because they have perspective of those students, out of the classroom as well. And if you have a school resource officer or someone in security, that discipline would be vital to your threat assessment team. And then there are tools. There are many tools out there, depending on what you want to use, that will help that group of people assess the individual's behavior. But again, to a point. If you deem them to be a medium risk, it's not likely that you are going to be the ones to conclude that they are dangerous or not. It is more likely that at that point you're going to need to bring in subject matter experts, which could be people you've identified with the right type of psych background to help you assess this person, whether they're on a path to dangerousness. So again, case management, you'd want to really establish your database of resources. Identify all of this in advance. If you've got to send someone for anger management training, who's going to do that? I don't know that many schools have employee assistance programs. In the corporate world, you'll see EAPs, and they're out there to help with things like that. But if you don't have that type of a resource, it's important to know, again, as part of the predictive work, we should predict what are the resources we're going to need in these situations, and then identify them, get the contact information ready, and be good to go so that if you have to act quickly, you'll get the help you need. Also, with the anonymous reporting, unlike Colorado, a lot of states don't have it, so therefore anonymous reporting as a capability is something that can be set up. If you don't have the resource to do it and would like assistance, let us know. We have the ability to help you stand up a call center and someone who would take these calls anonymously. And then you also want to think about, well, what are my return to school requirements going to be? Am I going to require medical clearance? Am I going to require a corrective action plan? Again, think broadly. Think student, think employee. And then what are your reentry guidelines? Have everything laid out. If they're coming back to school, is it something the parents are going to have to bring them? Is there going to be a safety plan? What is the support we're giving the student? And you would have that all set forth. And then finally, at your monitoring, you would want to identify the way you're going to monitor your students, all the different touch points, their friends, their parents. Are you going to monitor their social media? Are you going to look at their grades? Are you going to look at absenteeism? What are the things you're going to use to determine whether this person is complying with the program? So there again, the threat assessment piece has so many. The threat assessment program really consists of all of these pieces. Having a policy, one that says that the safety of your students is of paramount importance, and as part of your safety program at school, we are going to adopt a behavioral risk and threat assessment program. Again, setting forth what are the warning signs, understanding the behaviors, and making sure we've identified the right team of people that can come to the aid when there is a situation. So again, back to that multidisciplinary team. So there's a role for the board. The board is critical from an authorization perspective. They're the ones who are going to set the goals. They're the ones who are going to say and live the fact that this is going to be part of our culture. They're the ones who are going to attribute some type of funding, assign funding to a budget that you can use to implement all of these pieces. And they're the ones who will say, yes, you're empowered to appoint administrators on duty in all of your schools. You're going to train them, and of course, they're going to be part of your threat assessment team. And depending on how big your schools are, how many physical buildings you have. I mean, there are a lot of variables in determining, how many of these people you'll need to train. So identifying your roles and responsibilities will then enable you to figure out what are the internal resources we're going to need, what are the skill sets, do we have psychological and, social workers as part of our staff and faculty, and if not, where can we get those resources? The external resources typically are, people like forensic psychologists, people who can opine on dangerousness. And it could be clinical psychologists, it could be school psychologists, or police psychologists. There are many different types of specialties in that field, and they have capabilities that you can draw on a moment's notice as long as you've already arranged it and they know who you are and they know you might be calling, because time will be of the essence. And
Susie,
then again, back to the training. Yeah.
Susie, let me jump in and just ask you a couple of questions. Yep. I think you've done a great job.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of framing the program and why every school needs a behavioral threat risk assessment. In your experience, you've dealt with a lot of schools, public schools, private schools. There's sometimes it's a perception when you're talking about a private school that, hey, this isn't going to be our problem. That's over in the public schools. I know at Firestorm we've seen this happen in religious schools, private schools, as well. Can you comment a little bit around that fact?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, Jim. I think that what I would say is actually on a positive note that I think the independent schools, from a statistical perspective, have probably suffered fewer shootings than the public schools. However, I would also say that my experience is that the public schools have done more from a behavioral risk program implementation perspective than the private schools. Do I think the private schools are immune from bad actors? I don't. And in fact, one of the cases I was very involved in was a school shooting of a headmaster by a teacher. So again, I think it's important to think of your school not just as a school, but as a workplace, and take into account an entire population that I often see is not looked at as part of their workplace violence or their school safety program.
The example you gave of the teacher who shot the head of school, that was a religious school, and there was a termination, which was probably the precipitating or triggering event that led to that particular area. I know we were involved with another religious school where there was a student who was deemed as a suicide risk, and a kill list came out. Do you want to talk a little bit about kill lists?
Well, kill lists, again, so let's apply the program here and look at it. So we become aware of something. In that case that Jim's talking about, there was another student who saw that his peer had a kill list, people he would like to kill. Now, at first, when you first hear this, especially if you're not in the school world on a regular basis, you think it's quite outrageous and like, oh my God, call the police. What you find actually is that kill lists, unfortunately, are not all that uncommon. Now, does that mean, though, that you can shrug it off and say, oh, well, lots of kids write kill lists? I mean, absolutely not. Again, go back to the ball in the air, that snapshot. Is that kill list? It's a data point. Is the person escalating? Are they de-escalating? Is it something? It's absolutely something you have to investigate. So in that situation with the kill list, it required the school to convene its threat assessment team, and in that case, the team needed to evaluate and do an investigation of the student, and in that particular case, it did lead to a call to the police. Now, it wasn't a 911 call. 911 is really something you use when you believe the threat is imminent and you have no other time. In this case, what we did was instead we walked it in through the police department, their local police department. It wasn't a 911 call, but rather a direct outreach to an investigating unit within the police department. And actually, many police departments, depending on where you are geographically, have threat assessment divisions now within their police department. So in that case, the police department investigated. They made a visit to the home. They did a search of weapons. They did take the computer. And they had to make an assessment. And in that case, there was the decision was made that the student would not be asked to come back to school. So, again, the awareness comes from the fact that another child did report the kill list, so you had a really good, your program's working there. The kid knew it was a warning sign. He reported it. There was an investigation. They did a screening of the behavior. They contacted law enforcement, and they then did a case assessment, made the decision not to reinvite the student back to school, and that's where that went. And I think it is also important to know that they also were very concerned that the student receive intervention and get help, because clearly someone writing kill lists is not an everyday occurrence, and one must really look at what's behind that.
And the case management aspect on the chart, if we identify a student who is a risk to themselves or others, or there's a behavior of concern in the 9th grade, does that have an impact on their experience at school in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades?
Well, I would certainly think so. And again, I'm not the psychologist, nor am I an educator, and I'm going to defer to everyone else on this phone who I think can best know the answer to that question. I think it's fair to say, though, that these problems, if they don't get addressed, they will continue. They escalate. So we never know, again, I can't say this enough about that ball in the air. What are all the dynamics that the student's dealing with at home, in their peer group? We just don't know the stressors that they have, and that's why sometimes the investigation is so vital. And again, the monitoring, once we make a decision, okay, look, we don't think this kid is much at risk right now, but you know what? This is the kind of kid that if we don't get them the services that he or she needs, they could be a person who then is on a path to violence at a later time. So intervention is absolutely critical. And look, I know this is tough. Schools are so challenged from a resource perspective. There are so many students with so many needs. This is just one more. But again, if we can help this person early, this person will never want to commit the bad act. And that's what this program is really all about. It's not just stopping a shooting. It's about taking a kid in 5th grade and making sure that in 10th grade they never want to pick up a gun.
So every parent wants to know, is my child safe? I sent my child to school today. I would like to get my child home today. And I think we live in a world that the conflict and the fear factors and the exposures are greater than they were decades ago as we look into this area. Just as you have to have approved curriculum, just as you have to make sure that you're dealing with the educational needs of the child, or in the sports area, the athletic areas. So it's academics, but this area of behavioral threat is one of the key risk factors that needs to be addressed within each of your schools. Susie, if you'll just hit the next slide up. If someone would like an assessment of their school, and you can, and here it is, you can contact Firestorm. The cost of this has been underwritten by RenWeb, so just mention that, or we'll try to reach out to each of you as we go through that. If you'll hit the next slide, Susie, we want to just thank RenWeb for underwriting this webinar series and bringing this information out. And as we go to the last slide, if you've got questions, you can contact us at firestorm.com, send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or call us at 800-321-2219. Susie, do you have any last comments or advice you could give our listeners today?
Well, Jim, I would like to just make one last comment based on your last comment, about are my kids safe at your school? And I get asked that question all the time, and the answer is yes. Kids are safe at your school because statistically the law of large numbers protects all of us. But is that a satisfactory answer? Like, are we going to play roulette is really the question. And I find that really what brings it home is when the parents ask, what are you doing from a safety perspective? It's certainly a question I would ask. The fact that the statistics, hey, this is, the chances of it happening here are so slim, that's never going to be good enough for a parent. So I think having a program that demonstrates that you've really thought about this issue, that you have utilized, by the way, resources that a lot of you already have in place to do this. You may be redirecting them a little bit, but you've got most of this already. And once these individuals are trained on what to look for, in New York, where I am, you have the Dignity Act, And in the public schools, they're required to have an officer, a BeRThA officer is the acronym, and that person is focused on the bullying prevention and all of that. I mean, this is really something to tack on to that type of a program because, again, starting with the bullying, that is really where I would begin. So with that, Jim, I just wanted to say that, you know, from an internal resource perspective, a lot of the tools you need, you all have. It's just a matter of aligning them in a way that this program can be effective.
Thanks, Susie, and thank you all for listening today, and thank you for what you're doing for our children across the country and all the schools. The legislation Susie mentioned in New York is being pursued in other states. This is not just a public school issue. This is a school issue. Thanks for your time today. Until our webinar next month, thank you, and if you've got any questions, please reach out to us. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, Susie and Jacqueline and Bill. I appreciate your help today. Goodbye.